Hello and welcome to the lecture for Module 5. In Module 5, we're going to talk about how culture and religion impacts intimate partner violence, and we're also going to talk about what's commonly referred to as special victims. Throughout the semester to date, we spent a lot of time focusing on female victims of intimate partner violence. This week, we're going to get into some more of what's referred to as special victims, which includes men and those from the LGBTQ plus community, also disabled victims of domestic violence, and rural victims of domestic violence will be covered in different areas of the module this week. For the lecture, we're going to focus on culture, religion, honor killings, male victims, and LGBTQ plus community members. Let's get started. On the left side of your screen, you'll see a list of countries, 10 countries in fact, where immigrants are most likely to come from to the U.S. for the periods of 2018 to 2020. And you'll see they're just in alphabetical order. This doesn't indicate the proportion of immigrants from any one of these countries. They're just in alphabetical order, starting with China and ending at Vietnam. And these 10 countries represent the most common locations of immigrants to the U.S. And if you just look at that list for a second and you think about how many languages are spoken from people from these 10 countries, how many religions, how many different cultural practices are within China, much less when you compare China to Mexico. On the right side of your screen, we discuss how every culture and country has its own traditions, its own social norms, one or more languages are spoken in any given country, and certainly numerous religions. If you're a person who's working with victims of domestic violence in the United States, it's really important you're aware of just how diverse our country is, and that you could have clients or people you need to serve from any number of different countries around the world. This list of 10 countries, obviously, we know people come from all over the world to the United States for education, for work opportunities, to practice their religion freely, for any number of reasons. And when you have clients from a different country, you just need to be aware of that and be aware that they may come from practices and cultures and practice religions that you're not necessarily real familiar with. Now, are you expected to become an expert on every language spoken in every cultural practice? Of course not, but just your willingness to be open to learning about different cultures and religions will really help you as a practitioner or a service provider for victims of intimate partner violence. The reason that immigrants to the U.S. are included under our special victims category is because victims of domestic violence must deal with all the problems we've talked about this semester so far, plus a number of additional issues. So in each one of our categories of special victims, we'll be talking about how they suffer from all of the usual consequences of domestic violence that we've talked about so far this semester, in addition to a number of other challenges. For example, people who are immigrants to the United States who are victims of intimate partner violence may also have issues going on with their immigration status. They may have entered the country through any number of different means. They may not have the registration or paperwork that's required to allow them to remain in the country legally. Their legal immigration status may be pending. They may be at different parts of the process. That's another stressor intimate partner violence victims have to deal with, that on top of what's going on, they may be very afraid to go to any authority or service provider for fear that it may raise issues about their immigration status. It's also a way for an abuser to further threaten a victim by threatening to turn them in to an immigration official. You'll get kicked out of the country. You'll get deported. If you mess with me or if you tell anybody about what's going on, I'm going to get you in trouble with immigration authorities. Speaking a different language can present a number of barriers. If you speak a language that's not commonly spoken in your community or by law enforcement or service providers, that's going to present additional challenges to you seeking or getting help. Coming from another country, I know that I've been practicing law for over 20 years, and I'm still learning about our legal system, and I'm still learning about laws and practices that I didn't know about. So if I'm a lawyer and I don't thoroughly understand every law and how it's applied in the US, imagine the challenges faced by someone coming from another country who comes from a completely different political and governmental system than what we have. They certainly are not going to be aware of our laws or regulations and how that may impact them. And if you come from another country and you're alone or you have only one family member, you may have no social support when you're in the United States. You may not even have anyone in your community who speaks your same language or practice your religion or share some of the cultural practices that you have. So in addition to being isolated as a victim of intimate partner violence, as almost all victims are, victims from another country are even more isolated because other people don't share their language, their cultural practices, or their religion, and they have no family or friends in this country. Their nearest family member or friend could be thousands, 5,000 or 6,000 miles away. Another reason it's really important as a service provider for victims of intimate partner violence to be familiar with different religions and cultural practices is because 44.8 million people currently in the United States were born in a different country. 44.8 million. So it's highly likely that you will have someone seeking help from you who's from another country. And again, there's no expectation that you suddenly become an expert in every type of cultural practice or language or religion. Certainly that would be impossible. But again, just being open to the fact, just being knowledgeable that the victim in front of you may have cultural or religious practices that makes it more difficult for them to seek or get help, just that knowledge, just that awareness is really helpful. When we discuss culture, the World Health Organization and the United Nations and other international groups have studied the rates of domestic violence, specifically against women worldwide. And countries with the highest rates of domestic violence against women very often reflect cultures that are strongly patriarchal and or that practice adherence to very strict, often archaic religious rules that subjugate women. So we talked about patriarchal systems earlier in the semester, patriarchal systems being those that are dominated by men, run by men, organized by men. Property is often passed from the husband to the oldest son, to another son, to the grandson, completely leaving women out of inheritance, for example. And these countries, the 13 countries listed on the right, have been identified by the World Health Organization and the United Nations as having the highest rates of domestic violence against women. Again, they're in alphabetical order, but I've highlighted in bold with a star those countries that are the top 3 with the highest rates of incidence of domestic violence against women: Afghanistan, India, and Pakistan. For example, in Pakistan, it's very common to find statistics that upwards of 60% of all women are victims of domestic violence at one point during their lifetime. 60%. Some figures have it as high as 75 or 80%. And as you see, just kind of scanning this list of countries, it's also pretty easy to identify that within some of these countries, a lot of people practice a very strict religion that subjugates or oppresses women. Again, Afghanistan, India, and Pakistan have been identified by the World Health Organization and the United Nations as having the highest rates of domestic violence against women. So why are we talking about this when we're talking about special victims? Because, women aren't in the special victims category. Again, it's because of this cultural awareness. We need to be aware that when women are coming from these countries especially, that they may have grown up in an environment where domestic violence is not only permitted, it's encouraged and sometimes often enforced by their own religious leaders. And you're going to see an example of that in this module. Honor killings. You may be familiar with what an honor killing is. An honor killing is a murder of a family member due to the perpetrator's belief the victim has brought shame upon their family or has violated a rule of their religion. Oftentimes, in these extremely conservative religions, the underlying belief is that a woman's body, her actual physical body, is where the family's honor is stored. So if the woman takes any action that dishonors her body under the religious code, or even if something is done to her, say she is the victim of a sexual assault, that her family's honor has actually been damaged. So the belief is that a woman's body is actually the repository of the family's honor, and therefore any action a woman takes can dishonor her entire family. For example, under these practices is if a woman was outside and she was smoking a cigarette. That's something she does with her body. She's therefore dishonored her body, and she has therefore dishonored her family. It could be something as minor as just smoking a cigarette. We're going to discuss briefly the Kohistan case. You're also going to have a video on this in this module. What happened was in 2011, several young women in a very rural community in Pakistan went to a family wedding, and it was a very small wedding with just family members and a few friends. And someone started playing music. And when the music started to play, some of the guys there started dancing. And the women that were there, in particular 5 women, were smiling and clapping to the music. They were seated in a group. They were kind of huddled together. They're very conservatively dressed. You can see from this photograph that, only their face and their hands are showing. They're completely covered. And all they were doing was smiling and clapping as the guys were dancing. And unfortunately, someone recorded this with their cell phone. And when the video got out in that community, an extreme fundamentalist Muslim cleric decreed that the boys who were dancing and their families had to be killed, just for dancing at a wedding. He also ordered the murder of the 5 young women who were seen in the video clapping and smiling when the boys were dancing. And remember that the particular characteristic about an honor killing that's really important to remember is it's not done by a stranger. It's not just done by a member of your neighborhood or community. It's actually committed by your own family members. And in this case, 2 of the girls' fathers and 1 of their brothers joined with other family members, and they murdered the men who were seen dancing in the video, and they murdered all 5 of the women, simply for attending a wedding and enjoying themselves. The men were murdered because they were dancing, and they were dancing in front of the women, and because the women were clapping and smiling. This is Afzal Kohistan. This is kind of confusing because the name of the village is also this gentleman's last name, Kohistan. So Afzal Kohistan knew about this case because 3 of his brothers were dancing in the video. So when the three men were killed, 3 of those were his brothers, and he knew all 5 of the women. The 5 women were captured and tortured before they were murdered. The 3 brothers who were dancing in the video were all shot. And Afzal spent years of his own life trying to get justice for his own family members and for the women who were murdered, simply for appearing on this videotape. And he put himself and his family in a very dangerous situation. And you're going to see a video this week where a woman from Vice News, a female reporter, and a producer actually travel to this community in Pakistan, and they interview Afzal, and they even interview the cleric who ordered these murders. And Afzal, was out in the community and speaking to members of the media and going to court and trying to get someone brought to justice for the murders of these 8 people. And you'll hear from him yourself this week. Unfortunately, Afzal himself was murdered in March 2019. And when you hear the conditions, you hear what he's living under, and you see the conditions he's living in trying to protect his family in the video, it's important to know that he was ultimately murdered himself trying to get justice for his family members. So how often does this happen? Well, of course, we don't know for sure. But the United Nations reports there are approximately 5,000 honor killings around the world every single year. Every single year, 5,000 people are murdered for really minor acts of behavior, or they've done nothing wrong at all, but someone believes they've done something wrong, and they are murdered by their own family members. Approximately 1,000 of these honor killings occur in Pakistan every year, and 1,000 occur in India every year. So, of the 5,000 honor killings that occur worldwide every year, 2,000 of those occur just in Pakistan and India. Because we talked about patriarchal societies and a lot of these fundamentalist religions being run by men, it's not surprising to hear that 93% of honor killing victims are women. But it's important to remember, like in the Khoistan case, that men can also be the victims of honor killings. And the United States Department of Justice estimates that 30 honor killings occur in the United States every year. So we can't put this in our minds, put our mind stress by saying, well, this happens far away. This only happens in countries, thousands of miles from the United States. They actually happen here. Because remember that figure about 44 million people in the United States coming from other countries? Some of those people come from countries where honor killings are acceptable. And those honor killings are then carried out in the United States. So it's really important to remember that although the vast majority of victims are women, men can also be murdered as part of an honor killing, and that some of those occur in the United States. So why are honor killings committed? I put justifications in quotes here because, of course, there's no actual justification for killing someone under these circumstances. But these are common reasons that are given by clerics who order these killings to occur and by family members who've committed these murders. And what they'll tell you was that the woman had been the victim of a rape or a sexual assault. Think about that. A woman has already been raped or sexually assaulted, and on top of that, she, the victim, is determined to be now dishonored and to have brought dishonor to her family because she was the victim of a rape or a sexual assault. Honor killings can be carried out for the most minor behavior like inappropriate clothing, showing too much skin in public, laughing or flirting in public, being in public without a chaperone, drinking alcohol or smoking a cigarette, refusing a marriage proposal, divorce or separation. These women in these cultures are not allowed to leave their spouse for any reason, even severe near fatal abuse. So therefore, trying to divorce or separate from your spouse can also result in a person being murdered. And as you can imagine, premarital sex is absolutely verboten. And it's not even if one of these people has premarital sex. All you have to do is be suspected of having premarital sex, and that's enough to get you murdered. We're going to change topics and we're going to move on to male victims. Again, we talked a lot about female victims so far this semester. And I put a couple of caveats on different items we had saying, I recognize males are also victims of intimate partner violence and said we'll talk about that later. And now we're at the later. So we know from an earlier statistic that about 28.5% of men in the United States become victims of intimate partner violence during their lifetime. You often see this figure cited as about 25% or 1 in 4 men, like the graphic shows on the right side. But it's actually slightly higher than that. It's more about 28.5% of all men in the U.S. are victims of domestic violence at some point in their lifetime. Really critically important to remember that when women abuse men, it's the same type of abuse that men inflict on their female victims. It's physical abuse, sexual assault, isolation, verbal abuse, taking control of the finances. All of those types of abuse that we talked about men committing against women are often inflicted from women onto men. So it's the same type of abuse and the same type of tactics. But men are in our special victims group for a reason, right? And it's because not only do they face all of the challenges that all victims of intimate partner violence face, they have additional problems they have to overcome, including female abusers can manipulate police and are more likely to be viewed as the victim in family court. You're going to see a video this week that recreates intimate partner violence committed with a female abuser and a male victim. And she even says in the video, I'll tell the cops that you hit me. And the only reason you have a mark on you is because I was defending myself. She tells them that flat out. If you tell anybody, I'll tell the police I'm the victim, right? Many domestic violence service agencies do not offer any services to male victims, or they have significantly less services and support for men. So when a man is brave enough to reach out for help, often that help is not available. This often occurs with shelter. We have domestic violence shelters, so if a woman has to leave her house at 3, 4 o'clock in the morning with nothing but the clothes on her back, maybe with or without her children, that there's a safe place for her to stay for the night, or for more nights, or for weeks. And there's very few community that actually offers shelters for men. And of course, we don't want to put a male in a domestic violence shelter that's full of women who've just been abused by a man, right? So these men really need their own very safe and protected facilities to go, and too often they just simply don't exist. Men in our culture also face the stigma of being perceived as weak or not in control in the relationship. Remember, we still have a very patriarchal element to our own society, in our current year in the United States, where men are often expected to be strong and capable and to never cry and always be in control. And it's the man's job to control their woman, right? It's their job to control their partner. They're the king of the castle. So not only do men have all the issues to deal with that any domestic violence victim does, there's also this perception of like disbelief almost. Like, really? She hit you? Like, how is that even possible? Traditional gender roles complicate a man seeing himself as a victim and disclosing to family members or friends. So you can see that, it's particularly hard for men in our culture to even see themselves as a victim. And then too often when they seek help, that help isn't even available in their community. Moving on to another group in our special victims group would be the LGBTQ+. As most of you know, this stands for the lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, queer. Q is often used as questioning, plus meaning it also includes people who define themselves or identify themselves as being non-binary, for example. So it includes other groups within that. And members of this community have an even higher rate of intimate partner violence than some other groups, depending on the statistic and the source of information you look at. And that's because they can actually be victims in two separate ways. So of course, if you're in the LGBTQ plus community, you could have an abusive partner. However, people in this community are too often subjected to violence from their own parents or siblings. So that's an additional thing that victims in this group have to contend with. Not only may they have an abusive partner, they may have grown up with or still have to deal with a physically or verbally abusive parent or sibling. People in this group have experienced the same sorts of domestic violence that other victims do, whether it be physical, verbal, sexual, financial, but they're in our special victims group because they also have to face additional issues that a woman generally does not have to deal with as a victim. And one is being threatened to be outed. Outed means that you may be lesbian or gay or transsexual and not have told anyone that you work with or told your family members or friends. They may not know that about you. So an abusive partner will threaten that person. I'm going to tell your father that you're gay. I'm going to tell your boss that you're trans. So it's an additional type of threat these folks have to deal with. There's an increased lack of family support oftentimes in this community. And while many families are very supportive of their family members who identify in the LGBTQ plus community, there are often way too many families that show no support. Oftentimes, these people are completely kicked out of their families. They're completely shunned by their families purely because they identify as lesbian or gay. There's specific words used in verbal abuse, none of which I'm going to say here, and I know you know the words I'm talking about. There's a very specific derogatory terms that are used against people in this community. Hearing from that one person you trust in your life, these terms being used against you is especially hurtful. And folks in this community have a real justified lack of faith in the police and or the legal system. So in many states, gay marriage is still illegal. So how could a victim of intimate partner violence feel comfortable going to the police or to a legal system that doesn't even recognize their relationship as being legitimate under the law? So you want to talk about a feeling of prejudice or bias. The police officer you're seeking help from doesn't even believe that you're married and doesn't recognize your marriage under the law, and neither does the legal system. So again, that's an additional issue that a member of the LGBTQ plus community has to face as a victim, in addition to all the other stuff that comes with being a victim of domestic violence. The second part of abuse that folks in this community face, again, are from their own family members. So they are frequently subjected to acts of physical violence from parents and siblings. And we know from things we've talked about earlier in the semester, if you are a victim of domestic violence growing up, you are more likely to choose an abusive partner. So young, teenagers and, tweens who are LGBTQ are often thrown out of their family completely. They're just kicked out of their house. They're 15, 16, 17 years old or younger. They have no money, no job, no one to rely on, no one to go for help. And oftentimes this happens in very big cities, but it can also happen in rural areas. And now suddenly you're a 15 or a 16-year-old and you're living on the street. In fact, 40% of all homeless young people identify as being lesbian, gay, bisexual, trans, or queer. 40% of homeless young people. The rates of drug addiction and suicidality are much higher for LGBTQ plus youth than any other population. So not only do we have adult victims who are members of the LGBTQ plus community that have all these additional problems, then imagine being a teenager on top of it. That's just extraordinary hurdles for a young person to have to overcome. So that's the end of your Module 5 lecture. Of course, you have other things to do. You have reading in the textbook. The textbook reading jumps around a bit because I wanted you to look at 3 separate sections of information. One is family violence committed by police officers. So again, if you are married or dating or have broken up a relationship with a member of law enforcement, you can imagine how complicated, dangerous, and frightening that can be for a victim. You're going to cover victims with disabilities in other areas of the module and rural victims. So men and women and people in the LGBT community or who are disabled. And now they're in a rural environment. And if you think we have a lack of really good services in our communities, imagine living in the middle of nowhere, how you're going to get help. You have an article this week. It's written by leaders from 3 different major religions talking about how religion can be misused to perpetrate or condone domestic violence. You have 2 videos this week. One is the one about the case in Pakistan, the Kohistan case involving the video and the murder of the 5 women and 3 men, where you'll see Asfal Kohistan be interviewed, and the cleric who ordered their murders. You're also going to watch a really short video. It's only 9 minutes long. It's actually an actor, a college student in Britain, created this video to show what it looks like for a male to be the victim in an abusive relationship with the female as the perpetrator. And that video is just 9 minutes long. You're going to have a quiz due this week. It's on all the module items for number 5. So anything in module number 5 can be on your quiz. That's due no later than Monday at 11:59 p.m. And you do not have a project this week. As always, if you have any questions or need anything, please let me know.